Okay, so the area that we're in here is kind of a low-lying area. It's actually a little pond. In fact, if I pan down, you can see the water in front of me. And as we go a little farther, it gets deeper. So that area dominated mostly by grasses. So you can see that just this slight change in elevation has a dramatic effect on what plant species are growing in the area. The tree in front of me, the trees in front of me are not longleaf pine, although they have some of the same adaptations that longleaf pine have for growing in an area frequented by fire. You can see the thick layers of bark on those trees, protecting them from fire. And as we pan up the tree, you can see on some of the trees, like these guys over here, that there are actually some cones left on the tree. These are a species of pine called a pond pine, and the cones growing in those trees are called serotinous cones. Serotinous cones are found on conifer species that are adapted to fire. In fact, those cones only open up and drop their seeds in response to a fire. Longleaf pine do not have serotinous cones, but many other conifer species that grow in other fire-adapted forest communities around North America do have serotinous cones. One example is lodgepole pine, which grows out in the west in places like Yellowstone National Park. So you can see that just a slight change in elevation results in a completely new tree species and also plant community growing in that area. Quite a bit of diversity in this area. And I might ask you, what is it about these frequent fires that come through these areas that promotes the high levels of biodiversity that we see in these forests? It's typical for fires to burn in this area on roughly a 7 to 10 or 12 year cycle. And those fires will burn on that cycle naturally. The Forest Service mainly controls the fires that occur in this area, burning these forests again on roughly 7 to 10 year cycles. But even in the absence of human intervention, these fires will continue to burn those 7 to 10 year cycles. Why do you think that is? What is it about this area that encourages these cyclic forest fires? In fact, we know this happens because oftentimes when a fire does burn through these areas, it leaves a little scar in the xylem. And when these trees grow up and get old and they are chopped down or fall down, we can actually look at the fire scars in the trees and count the number of rings and determine how often those fires have burned. And again, even in the absence of human-controlled burns, we still see these fires burning on those 7 to 10 year cycles. Okay, so one of the things I wanted you guys to note about these longleaf pine forests is all of the pine needles that have accumulated on the forest floor. You can see these longleaf pine produce very, very long needles, hence the name longleaf pine. And what's really interesting about these trees is that they don't only possess adaptations for surviving the frequent fires that burn through this forest. It appears that they actually possess adaptations that encourage fire. These long needles are filled with resins that make them highly flammable. They burn very quickly, sort of flash fires, spread through this area quickly, but they get hot enough to burn up a lot of the surrounding vegetation. And so what of course that does for these plants is it eliminates competition. So other fast-growing tree species that could grow up faster, outcompete them for nutrients in the soil, water, and also sunlight, why they're eliminated in that environment because of these needles that are put out. And so earlier I asked you, why is it that these fires burn in this area on roughly 7 to 10 year cycles naturally, even without human intervention? And the answer lies in the needles and the surrounding understory, the grasses and shrubs. It takes about 5, 6, 7, 10 years for enough of these needles to accumulate and enough grasses and shrubs in the understory to grow up to produce enough fuel for a fire. But when those fires burn, they're typically hot enough that they kill off most of the surrounding vegetation. And again, longleaf win out in the competition in that environment. And so suppress fires, and of course everything else around us here, all these small trees and shrubs will begin to grow up, shade out the seedlings, and pretty soon this forest transitions into something else. So it isn't that suppressing fires will cause the forest to disappear. Rather, it's that the forest will transition to something else, something different. And that something different is going to be much more like what we saw over there by Highway 17. Much denser, much thicker, very low biodiversity. And I might ask you, so what? Who cares? So what if the forest transitions to something more like that? Why should we care about that? After all, isn't a forest just a bunch of trees? So you can see in this area of the forest, there are quite a few hardwood trees beginning to grow up in this area. This is a consequence of this area not having experienced a fire, probably in about 5 or 6 years. You can see that it has experienced fire in the past because of the fire scars around the base of the trees. But these trees growing in front of me here and in the foreground are mostly sweet gum, which is a common native species in this area. It tends to like kind of wet, boggy areas. And in fact, in this area, you can see there's a little runnel through which water is traveling, but you can see more of those in the distance. And so these sweet gum trees are fairly fast-growing trees. And in the absence of fire, these trees would grow up. They would shade out the surrounding young longleaf pines that germinate from seeds that are dropped by these adult trees. They would steal nutrients, shade out those plants, and over time this forest would transition to something very different in the absence of fire. A forest that's dominated more by hardwood trees, oaks, water oaks, sweet gum, sassafras, and a variety of other native hardwood trees. And so the interesting thing about fire in this area is that when fire sweeps through these communities, it kills off these hardwood species of trees and other species of pines that don't have all those adaptations, those growth and structural adaptations for surviving fire. And they're burned up in the fire. Okay, here I am in Halfway Creek Campground, just down from the Steed Creek, Halfway Creek Road intersection, which is where we started our field trip. Very buggy here. If you look back at the forest behind me, you can see that this is a very, very, very different forest than the one that we were in earlier. This is a forest that's dominated by hardwood tree species. There are very few pine trees growing in this area. And as you can imagine, the reason for that is fire suppression. Right, not logging, fire suppression. So this is a campground. They've been suppressing fires in this area for many, many years. I've been living in Charleston now some 30 years. I've never seen them burn in this area. And if you look down at the base of the trees, you don't see any fire scars or anything like that. And so This is just a dramatic illustration of what happens when you suppress fires. The forest transitions to something else, a different forest, a forest that's dominated mostly by hardwood species. If you look up in the canopy of this forest, you'll see it's very dense, and as a consequence of that, very little is growing in the understory. There's very low diversity here, maybe about 10 or 20 different species at most. And so most of those ecological interactions, those interactions between plant species, algae, ferns, grasses, shrubs, the insects, the pollinators, butterflies, bats, birds, etc., most of those ecological connections fall to the wayside in this community. And so very low diversity. And so again, it isn't that if we suppress fires that the forest will go away. It's just that it will transition into something else. Now, you'll also notice that this, even in spite of the fire suppression that's occurred in this area, many of these areas are still fairly open. And you can imagine that part of the reason for that is because of humans. Humans are camping in this area, they're going around collecting firewood, and so on and so forth. And of course, that keeps the forest floor clear of much of the debris that accumulates over time in areas where humans aren't typically found. And so again, this is just a dramatic illustration of what happens when fires are suppressed.